She was 7 years old, standing in a freezing alley at midnight, watching her mother pull food from a dumpster. When her mother handed her a bread roll, the little girl didn't eat it. She tore it in half and whispered, "This half is for tomorrow, Mama." She was 7, and she already knew that no one was coming to help them. Her own father had thrown them out and told the whole world a lie so cruel that even her grandmother turned her back on them. But what that man didn't know was that the wrong person had just seen everything. And what happens next is a story you will never forget. The alley behind House of Bellavita Kitchen smelled like cold garlic and wet concrete. It was 11:40 on a Tuesday night in November, and the temperature had dropped below freezing 2 hours ago. The restaurant's back door was propped open with a cinder block, leaking a ribbon of yellow light across the dumpsters. The kitchen crew had already gone home. The only sound was the low hum of the walk-in cooler and the scrape of something moving near the trash. Callum Rourke noticed the sound before he saw anything. He was standing at the far end of the alley, his back against the brick wall, finishing a cigarette he didn't even want. He'd stepped out of a meeting at the social club 3 doors down, a meeting about money, about territory, about a man who owed more than he could pay. The usual business, on the kind of conversation that left a metallic taste in his mouth, no matter how many times he had it. He wasn't in a hurry to go back inside. Then he heard it again, a rustle, a small, careful sound near the dumpsters. Callum didn't move. He was a man who had survived 43 years in a world that killed careless people, and the first rule he'd ever learned was simple: watch before you act. So he watched. A woman crouched near the larger of the 2 dumpsters. She had pulled the lid open just enough to reach inside, and her arm was buried to the elbow in garbage bags. Her coat was thin, too thin for November, and her dark hair was pulled back in a loose knot that had started to come undone hours ago. She moved quickly, but quietly, like someone who had already been chased away from places like this before. And then Callum saw the second figure. A little girl, small, maybe 6 or 7 years old, standing 2 feet behind the woman with her arms wrapped around herself. She wore a puffy jacket that was zipped all the way to her chin, but it was a summer jacket, the kind meant for cool evenings in September, not the dead weight of a November night. Her sneakers had no socks visible above them. She was shivering, but she wasn't making a sound. The woman pulled something from the dumpster, a bread roll, still in its paper wrapper. She turned and handed it to the girl with a whisper that Callum couldn't hear. The little girl took it with both hands, looked at it, and then, instead of eating it, she carefully tore it in half and held one piece back toward her mother. Callum's cigarette burned down to the filter. He didn't feel it, and the woman shook her head. She pushed the girl's hand back gently and whispered something else. The girl hesitated, then took a small bite of her half. She chewed slowly, like she was trying to make it last. Then she slipped the other half into the pocket of her jacket. She was saving it. A 7-year-old girl, standing in a freezing alley behind a restaurant, was saving half a bread roll she'd pulled from the garbage because she didn't know when she'd eat again. Callum Rourke had seen violence. He had ordered it, received it, and survived it more times than he could count. He had watched men beg. He had watched men lie. He had sat across from people in the worst moments of their lives and felt nothing more than the cold arithmetic of consequence. But something about the way that little girl put the bread in her pocket, carefully, like it was something precious, cracked open a door inside him that he had sealed shut 6 years ago. And behind that door was a memory he could not afford to revisit. Not here, not now. He stepped back into the shadow and kept watching. The woman found a styrofoam container next. She opened it, smelled it, and closed it again quickly. Whatever was inside had turned. She set it on the ground and kept searching. The little girl stayed perfectly still, watching her mother with eyes that were too alert, too serious for a child her age. She wasn't fidgeting. She wasn't complaining. She was standing guard. Callum recognized that look, and he had seen it on the faces of boys who grew up in his neighborhood, children who learned too early that the world was not a safe place and that the only person they could depend on was standing right in front of them. But those were boys who'd been hardened by the streets, by absent fathers and overworked mothers and a system that had written them off before they turned 10. This was a little girl in a jacket with flowers on it, standing next to a dumpster, protecting her mother from nothing and everything at the same time. The woman found another container. Pasta, it looked like, and this one passed whatever test she'd been applying. She closed it gently, tucked it under her arm, and reached back inside for more. Her movements were getting faster now, more desperate. Callum could see her hands shaking, and he didn't think it was just from the cold. Then the back door of the restaurant swung open wider, and a busboy stepped out with 2 trash bags. He was young, maybe 19, wearing a stained apron and earbuds. He didn't see the woman at first. He swung the first bag toward the dumpster, and it hit the lid with a clang that echoed off the alley walls. The little girl flinched so hard her whole body jerked backward, not a normal flinch, not the kind of startled reaction any child might have to a loud noise. This was something deeper, something trained into her nervous system by repetition. She flinched, the way people flinch when they've learned that loud sounds are followed by pain. The busboy saw the woman then. He stopped, looked at her, looked at the girl, and his expression cycled through confusion, pity, and discomfort in the space of 2 seconds. "Hey," he said, "you can't be back here." The woman straightened up. She held the styrofoam container against her chest like a shield. "I'm sorry," she said. Her voice was hoarse. "We're leaving." "I mean, I don't make the rules," the busboy said, already stepping back toward the door. "But my manager's still here and he'll call the cops. Just, you know." "I understand." The woman reached for her daughter's hand. "Come on, Elise." The girl took her mother's hand. She didn't look at the busboy. She didn't look at the restaurant. She kept her eyes on the ground and walked close to her mother's side, matching her stride step for step, like she'd practiced this retreat before. They moved toward the mouth of the alley. The woman's head was down. Her shoulders were drawn in tight. Everything about her posture said the same thing: "Please don't look at me." They were 10 feet from Callum when he spoke. "Wait." The woman stopped instantly. Her grip on her daughter's hand tightened. She turned just enough to see him, a tall man in a dark coat stepping out of the shadow near the wall, and her face went rigid with fear. She pulled her daughter behind her in one swift motion, putting her own body between the child and the stranger. "Who are you?" she said. There was no tremble in her voice, despite everything, the hunger, the cold, the humiliation of being caught digging through garbage. Her voice was steel. Callum raised both hands slightly. Open palms. The universal gesture of someone who is not reaching for anything. "I'm nobody you need to be afraid of," he said. The woman didn't move. In her eyes scanned him, the coat, the shoes, the watch on his wrist, and Callum could see her calculating. Expensive clothes, standing alone in an alley near midnight. This was not a man who belonged to her world, and she knew it. "We don't need anything," she said. Behind her, the little girl, Elise, peered around her mother's hip. Her eyes found Callum's face and held there. And she didn't speak. She just looked at him with an expression that was half curiosity and half the quiet wariness of an animal that had been cornered before. "You don't need anything," Callum repeated. He kept his voice low, even, no authority in it, no edge, just words. "That styrofoam box you're carrying, what's in it?" The woman's jaw tightened. She didn't answer. "Because if it's the rigatoni from tonight's special, it's actually not bad," Callum said. But the chicken from yesterday would have been thrown out around 8, and that's been sitting in there for almost 4 hours. I wouldn't eat that." The woman stared at him. Something shifted in her face. Not trust, not yet, but a fracture in the wall she'd built around herself. The kind of crack that appears when someone says something so unexpectedly human that the prepared defenses don't know how to respond. "How do you know what they serve here?" she asked. "I own the building." Silence. The alley seemed to get colder. The little girl tugged on her mother's coat. "Mama," she whispered. "I'm okay, we can go." It was the way she said it, not pleading, not whining, a 7-year-old child reassuring her mother that she could handle being hungry for one more night, because she could see that her mother was scared. And she didn't want to make things worse. Callum felt the door inside him crack open another inch. Behind it, a voice he hadn't heard in 6 years, small, certain, brave in the way that only children can be, said almost the same words. "I'm okay, Daddy. We can go." He closed his eyes for half a second. When he opened them, His voice was different, quieter, not the voice of a man who owned buildings and sat in meetings about territory. The voice of someone standing at the edge of a wound that had never healed. "The restaurant's closed," he said, "but the kitchen's still warm. There's food that hasn't been thrown out yet. Real food. Oh, on plates. If you want to come inside, you can eat. Both of you. No conditions, no questions." The woman shook her head. "We don't take." "It's not charity," Callum said. And he wasn't sure why he said it that way, or why it mattered to frame it that way. But he could see the pride in her posture, rigid and unyielding even as her body shook from the cold, and he understood that pride was the last thing she had left. He would not ask her to surrender it. "It's Tuesday night," he continued. "Whatever's left in the kitchen gets tossed. You'd be saving me from wasting it." The woman looked at him for a long time. Her eyes were dark and exhausted and full of the kind of suspicion that comes from being let down so many times that kindness itself feels like a trap. Then Elise spoke again, not to her mother, to Callum. "Do you have soup?" she asked. Her voice was so small it almost disappeared into the cold air. Callum looked down at her. She was watching him with those two old eyes, and her hands balled into fists inside her jacket sleeves, her small face pale in the dim light. She had asked a question that was so simple, so ordinary, and so heartbreaking in context that it landed in Callum's chest like a fist. "Yeah," he said. "I think there's soup." Elise looked up at her mother. She didn't say, "Please." She didn't beg. She just looked, and in that look was everything a child shouldn't have to communicate at 7 years old. "I'm hungry. I'm cold. I'm tired of pretending I'm not." The woman's composure broke, not dramatically. No sobbing, no collapse. Just a single breath that came out shaking, and a slight drop of her shoulders, and a nod so small it might have been imagined. "Okay," she said. "Okay." The kitchen of House of Bellavita was exactly as Callum had described it. Warm. And the industrial ovens had been turned off, but the residual heat still hung in the air like a blanket. Stainless steel counters gleamed under the fluorescent lights. The floor had been mopped. Everything was clean and quiet and safe in a way that felt almost violent compared to the alley outside. Callum moved through the kitchen with a familiarity that surprised the woman. He pulled a large pot from the walk-in cooler, minestrone, still warm enough that it only needed a few minutes on the stove. He found bread in a basket near the prep station, a block of parmesan, a bowl of olives. He set everything on the counter with the efficiency of someone who had done this before, though not recently, and not for strangers. Elise sat on a stool at the prep counter, her legs dangling. She watched Callum with open fascination, and her fear fading in increments as the warmth of the kitchen seeped into her skin. Her mother stood near the door, arms crossed, watching both of them. "I'm Vivian," the woman said abruptly, like she'd made a decision. "Viv." Callum set a bowl in front of Elise and ladled soup into it. Steam rose between them. "Callum," he said, "and this is Elise." "I know," he said. "I heard you in the alley." Elise picked up the spoon. She looked at the soup, then at her mother, then back at the soup. She took one careful sip, then at another. Then her eyes closed, and for a moment her whole body seemed to relax, shoulders dropping, fists unclenching, the constant low-grade tension that she carried like a second skin, finally loosening its grip. "It's good," Elise whispered. Callum set a second bowl in front of Vivian. She hesitated, and he didn't push. He simply turned around to find a glass and filled it with water from the tap. "When did you last eat?" he asked. His back was to her. The question was casual, conversational, directed at no one in particular. Vivienne picked up the spoon. "Yesterday," she said. "Morning." "And her?" "She ate yesterday too. I made sure she ate first." Callum set the water on the counter. He didn't sit down. He leaned against the opposite counter and crossed his arms, giving them space. Giving her room to eat without being watched. "How long have you been on the street?" he asked. Vivian's spoon stopped halfway to her mouth. She set it down. 11 days. "Where were you before?" "Mr. Rourke." "Callum." "Callum." She pressed her lips together. You said no questions. I did. He paused. But I'm asking anyway. Well, you can choose not to answer. Vivian looked at her daughter. Elise was eating steadily now, focused entirely on the soup, bread clutched in her other hand. She wasn't listening. Or she was listening but had learned not to show it. My husband threw us out, Vivian said. The words came out flat, practiced, like she'd said them before, to someone, a shelter intake worker, a hotline volunteer, a stranger on a park bench, and had learned to strip them of all emotion so she could get through the sentence without breaking. 11 days ago, my husband told me to leave the house. He'd changed the locks while I was picking Elise up from school. Our things were in garbage bags on the front porch. He had a lawyer on the phone. He told me if I didn't leave quietly, he'd call the police and tell them I was trespassing. Trespassing? Yeah, in your own home. His name is on the deed. He made sure of that when we bought it. I didn't think anything of it at the time. I trusted him. She said the word trusted like it was a bone she'd broken and never set properly. He told me he had proof that I'd been unfaithful, that he'd found messages on my phone, that he'd spoken to the man I was supposedly seeing. Were you? Vivian's eyes snapped to his. No. One word, no elaboration, no defense, just the truth, offered without apology. Callum believed her. He wasn't sure why. He'd spent a lifetime reading lies, and the best liars he'd ever met could look you dead in the eye and sell you fiction with the conviction of a priest. But there was something in the way Vivian said that single word that left no room for doubt. She wasn't defending herself. She was stating a fact. In the way you might say, the sky is blue or the ground is beneath your feet. She was past the point of caring whether anyone believed her. He fabricated everything, Vivian continued, her voice thinning. Screenshots, text messages from a number I'd never seen. He showed them to my mother. He showed them to my sister. He called my friends. He posted on social media, not directly, just enough. Vague posts about betrayal and heartbreak, enough that people filled in the blanks. People believed him. Everyone believed him. She picked up her spoon again but didn't eat. She just held it, staring at the surface of the soup. Garrett has always been charming, likable, the kind of man who remembers people's birthdays and holds doors open and coaches Little League. Everyone loves Garrett. And you, I was the quiet one. The one who stayed home. The one nobody really knew because I was always behind him, always in his shadow. So when he said I'd cheated on him, it was easy. It was easy for people to believe because I wasn't real enough to them to defend. Callum was quiet for a moment. In the silence, Elise finished her soup and reached for the bread. She tore off a piece, ate it, and then, again, slipped a piece into her jacket pocket. The same pocket where she'd put the bread from the alley. Vivian saw it. Her face tightened, and she looked away quickly, pressing her fingers against her eyes. She didn't cry, but the effort of not crying was visible in every line of her body. "Baby," Vivian said softly, "you don't have to save it, there's more." Elise looked at her mother, then she looked at the bread basket, half full on the counter, and something in her expression said she didn't believe it, that she understood abundance was temporary, that what was here now might not be here tomorrow. And the only safe thing to do was to prepare for the worst, while the worst wasn't happening. "I know," Elise said, but she didn't take the bread out of her pocket. Callum turned around and opened the walk-in cooler. He stood inside it for 10 seconds longer than he needed to. It wasn't because he was looking for something. It was because he needed a moment alone with the feeling that had settled in his chest. Heavy, sharp, familiar. His daughter's name had been Rosie. She was 5 when she died. An accident. Wrong place, wrong time. A car that ran a red light on a Tuesday afternoon while Callum's wife, Angela, was crossing the street with their daughter's hand in hers. Angela survived. Rosie didn't. And Angela never forgave herself, and Callum never forgave the world, and the marriage collapsed under the weight of a grief that was too enormous for 2 people to carry together, so they each carried it alone and separately, which meant they carried it forever. Rosie used to save crackers in her pockets. Animal crackers. She'd eat 2 and save the rest for later, not because she was hungry, but because she liked knowing they were there, a 5-year-old's version of securities. Angela used to find crumbs in the laundry and laugh about it. Nobody had laughed about it in 6 years. Callum came out of the cooler with a container of tiramisu. He set it on the counter next to Elise. "Dessert," he said. His voice was steady. No one would have known anything had happened behind the cooler door. And Elise's eyes went wide. She looked at the tiramisu, then at Callum, then at her mother, and for the first time since he'd seen her in the alley, the wariness left her face entirely, just for a second. Just long enough for her to look like what she actually was. A 7-year-old girl who had been offered something sweet after 11 days of nothing. "Really?" she said. "Really?" She picked up a spoon and took a small, careful bite. Cocoa powder dusted her upper lip. She didn't wipe it away. She just looked at Callum with an expression that was closer to wonder than anything else and said, "Thank you." 2 words, nothing more. But Callum Rourke, who had sat across from judges and prosecutors and men who wanted him dead and felt nothing, had to turn away from a 7-year-old girl to keep his composure. And he made a phone call while they ate. He stepped into the dining room, dark, chairs stacked on tables, and called a woman named Grace Pellegrino. Grace ran a property management company that handled several of Callum's buildings. She was efficient, discreet, and asked no questions that weren't directly related to square footage and lease terms. "The apartment on Ashford," he said. "The 2-bedroom above the bookstore. Is it still empty?" "Since October," Grace said. "Why? I have a viewing scheduled Thursday." "Cancel it. I need it furnished by tomorrow afternoon. Clean sheets, towels, food in the refrigerator, enough for a woman and a young child." A pause. "Is this a relocation situation?" "It's a favor." Another pause. Grace had been working with Callum for 12 years. And she knew the weight of his pauses and the economy of his words. "I'll have it ready by 2, she said. "One more thing. There's a school, Whitmore Elementary, on 6th. I need to know the enrollment process, what paperwork is needed, how fast it can happen." Callum. "That's it, Grace." "Thank you." He hung up and stood in the dark restaurant for a moment. Through the kitchen door, he could hear Elise saying something to her mother, too quiet to make out, and Vivian's low, murmured response. They sounded like 2 people at the end of a very long day, which, Callum supposed, they were. They'd been at the end of a very long day for 11 days straight. He went back in. Vivian had finished eating. She was sitting straight again, her composure reassembled, her walls rebuilt. And she looked at him with an expression that Callum recognized from his own mirror. The face of someone who accepts help but is already preparing for the moment it's taken away. "Oh, we should go," she said. "We've taken enough of your time." "Where?" She didn't answer. "There's a shelter on Greenpoint," he said. "But it's full most nights by 9. The one on Atlantic has beds, but they separate mothers from children over 5. So where exactly are you going?" Vivian's chin lifted. "We'll manage." "I don't doubt that you'll manage. You've been managing for 11 days. You'll probably manage for 11 more, and then 20 more after that. And your daughter will learn to manage too. She'll learn that food comes from garbage, and sleep comes in doorways, and the world is a place where managing is the best she can hope for." He didn't raise his voice. He didn't have to. "Or you can let me help, tonight, and we can figure the rest out tomorrow." "Why?" Vivian's voice cracked on the word. The first real crack. "Why do you care? You don't know us. You don't know me." Callum looked at Elise. She had fallen asleep on the counter, her head on her folded arms, the spoon still in her hand. Cocoa powder was still on her lip. In sleep, she looked her actual age, small and fragile and utterly dependent on adults who had, so far, almost universally failed her. "I had a daughter," Callum said. "She'd have been about Elise's age." Had. The past tense hung in the air between them. Vivian looked at him, really looked, and saw something she hadn't seen before. Not the expensive coat, not the watch, not the careful authority in his voice. She saw grief. Old grief, the kind that doesn't go away because you don't talk about it, the kind that lives in the bones. She didn't ask what happened. She didn't offer sympathy. She simply nodded, a small knowing nod, and said, "Okay, okay. I'll accept your help tonight, just tonight. That's all I'm offering." It was a lie, and they both knew it. But it was the kind of lie that allowed two proud, wounded people to move forward without admitting that something had already shifted between them. Something that had nothing to do with charity and everything to do with recognition. The apartment on Ashford Street was above a used bookstore called Foxglove and Company. It had 2 bedrooms, a small kitchen, hardwood floors that creaked near the bathroom, and windows that looked out onto a quiet side street lined with maples. Grace had moved fast. The place smelled like fresh linen and pine cleaner when Callum unlocked the door the next afternoon. He'd driven Vivienne and Elise to a motel the night before. Nothing fancy, just clean and warm and safe, with a lock on the door and a bed that didn't come with conditions. He'd paid for 3 nights and left his phone number on a piece of paper on the nightstand. "In case you need anything," he said, and left before she could argue. She called the next morning, not to ask for anything, just to say that Elise had slept through the night for the first time in 11 days. That she'd woken up and asked if the soup place was real, or if she'd dreamed it. One that she'd eaten the bread from her pocket for breakfast before Vivienne could stop her, and then been confused when Vivienne told her there was more food at the front desk, a continental breakfast, juice and muffins and fruit, and that she could eat as much as she wanted. "She didn't believe me," Vivienne said on the phone. Her voice was different, still tired, still guarded, but with something underneath, the faintest pulse of something that might have been relief. "She thought I was joking." Callum was standing in his office when she told him that. He was looking out the window at the river. His hand tightened on the phone, and he said nothing for a moment, because there was nothing to say that would be adequate. "Bring her to Ashford Street this afternoon," he said. "There's an apartment you can use." "Callum, it's empty." "No one's using it. You'd be doing me a favor. Empty units get broken into." She knew it was another gentle lie. But she came anyway. The first week was about survival. Vivienne slept 12 hours a night for 3 days straight, her body finally surrendering to the exhaustion it had been holding at bay. Elise explored the apartment with careful, methodical attention, opening every cabinet, checking every closet, counting the towels and the forks and the cans in the pantry. She was taking inventory, cataloging resources, making sure she knew exactly what was available, because somewhere deep in her 7-year-old mind, she still believed it could all disappear. Callum kept his distance. He checked in once a day, a text, a phone call, a brief visit to drop off groceries. He didn't push. He didn't ask about the husband. He didn't try to fix anything that hadn't been asked to be fixed. He simply made sure they had what they needed, and then stepped back. It was Vivienne who eventually broke the silence about Garrett. She was sitting on the apartment's small balcony on the 7th day after Elise had gone to bed, when Callum stopped by with a bag of clothes that Grace had assembled. Winter jackets, boots, warm socks, a backpack for Elise. Vivienne took the bag, set it on side, and then came back to the balcony and sat down in the cold air. "He planned it for months," she said, as if they were in the middle of a conversation that had never stopped. Callum leaned against the railing. He didn't sit. He just listened. "I keep going back over it, trying to find the moment it started, and I think it was around March, last March. And he started working late. Not every night, but 2 or 3 times a week, and he said there was a new project at the firm, a restructuring, and he needed to be there for the analysts. I believed him because I had no reason not to. We'd been married for 8 years. 8 years, Callum. I never once questioned where he was." She paused. Her hands were wrapped around a mug of tea that had gone cold 20 minutes ago. "Then in the summer he started picking fights, small ones. He'd criticize the way I loaded the dishwasher. He'd say I spent too much time at the gym and not enough time with Elise, which was absurd because I arranged my entire schedule around her. He was building a case. I see that now. He was creating a history of conflict, a pattern, so that when he finally made his move, and it would look like the marriage had been deteriorating for months. And in a way it had, because he was making it deteriorate." "Classic setup," Callum said quietly. Vivienne looked at him. "You recognize it?" "I've seen men do worse for less." She nodded, as if this confirmation, from a man who had clearly seen the full spectrum of human manipulation, validated something she'd been trying to tell herself for weeks. "The messages he showed everyone, they were real messages, from a real phone number, but I never sent them. He created an account, a fake contact. He spent weeks writing conversations with himself, making it look like I was having an affair with someone from my gym. He was meticulous about it. The messages referenced real places. The coffee shop near the gym, a restaurant I'd mentioned wanting to try, and inside jokes that he wove in to make them seem authentic. He even timed the messages to correspond with the hours when I was actually at the gym, so if anyone checked my schedule, it would align. He even created a fake social media profile for this person, photos of a real man I don't even know who. Just someone whose pictures he downloaded from a travel blog. Attractive, fit, the kind of man that would make the story believable. He gave him a name, a job, a history. He built an entire human being out of nothing, and then he built an affair between that person and me. Why? Because he wanted Tessa. Tessa Whitford. She's his co-worker. 28 years old. No children, no complications. They'd been together for at least a year. I found that out after he threw us out, when a mutual friend finally told me what she'd been too afraid to say for months. But Garrett didn't want to be the man who left his wife and child for another woman. That would damage his reputation, his image. He's a deacon at our church. He coaches youth basketball. He volunteers at the food bank every Thanksgiving. He's built an entire public identity as the dependable, upstanding family man, and he wasn't willing to sacrifice that. He needed me to be the villain. The cruelest part, Vivian continued, her voice dropping, is that he was patient about it. He didn't rush. He laid the groundwork for months, and then, on the day he decided to act, he did everything at once, changed the locks, packed our things, called my mother, my sister, our friends. By the time I picked Elise up from school and drove home, my entire life had been disassembled. Every relationship, every safety net, every place I could have turned, he had gotten there first. I walked up to my own front door, carrying my daughter's backpack, and the key didn't work, and there were garbage bags on the porch, and my phone was already ringing with my mother's number, and when I answered, the first thing she said was, "How could you do this to him?" Callum understood this with a precision that came from decades of watching people construct narratives. In his world, men lied for money and power. In Vivienne's world, her husband had lied for something even more corrosive, the preservation of his own self-image. He hadn't just wanted to be free. He'd wanted to be the victim. He'd wanted the sympathy, the support, at the righteous indignation of their entire community, directed at Vivienne while he walked away clean. "Has anyone challenged him?" Callum asked. "Who would?" My mother called me after she saw the messages. She didn't ask if they were real. She just said, "How could you do this to him?" My sister stopped returning my calls. My best friend, the woman who stood next to me at my wedding, texted me that she needed space. Space. Vivienne laughed. It was a short, bitter sound. They all needed space from me. None of them needed to ask if it was true. And legally? He's filed for full custody. He says I'm unstable. He says I abandoned the family home. He says I'm unfit. And right now, sleeping in a motel and eating from garbage cans, I look exactly like what he's describing. Callum said nothing for a long time. Below them, the street was quiet. A couple walked past with a dog. A car turned the corner. Ordinary life continuing at its ordinary pace. "What's his full name?" Callum asked. Vivienne looked at him. "Why?" "Because I want to know who we're dealing with." "We." She didn't miss it. The word sat between them, small but immense. "Garrett Harlow," she said. "He works at Kessler Bryce Financial. He lives at 22 Birchwood Lane, and he has no idea that I have nowhere to go because he doesn't care." Callum did not rush. He never did. He spent the next 2 weeks learning about Garrett Harlow, the way he learned about anyone who entered his orbit, methodically, patiently, from multiple angles. He didn't hack into accounts. He didn't send men to follow Garrett's car. He didn't need to. Into what Callum Rourke had was something far more valuable than force. He had a network, an ecosystem of people in every layer of the city. Courthouse clerks, property managers, bartenders, accountants, cleaners, delivery drivers, people who owed him favors, people who respected him, people who simply knew that being on Callum's good side was preferable to the alternative. Within a week, he had a clear picture. Garrett Harlow was 35 years old, mid-level analyst at a financial services firm, good salary, but not extraordinary. The house on Birchwood Lane had been purchased 4 years ago, with a down payment that came, according to public records, entirely from Garrett's savings. But Callum's accountant, a meticulous woman named Sonia, found something interesting in the county assessor's files. The original down payment had been co-funded by a transfer from a joint savings account that Vivienne had contributed to for 3 years before the purchase. Garrett had simply moved the money through 2 accounts before closing, making it appear to come from his own funds alone. It was small-time fraud, dressed up in spreadsheets. More importantly, Garrett had been sloppy. The fake phone number he'd used to create the false text messages was tied to a prepaid SIM card purchased at a convenience store near his office. The store had security cameras. The social media profile he'd created for Vivienne's fictional lover had been made from an IP address that, through a contact at the internet service provider who owed Callum a considerable debt, traced directly back to Garrett's home Wi-Fi network. The man had built a careful lie, but he had built it from cheap materials. And then there was Tessa Whitford, 28, junior analyst at the same firm. She had been posting carefully curated photos on her private Instagram account. Brunch at the restaurant Garrett used to take Vivienne to, weeknight dinners at Birchwood Lane, a picture of her feet propped on what was unmistakably the living room coffee table that Vivienne had picked out from a catalog 3 years ago. In one photo, visible in the background through an open doorway, a pink bedroom, Elise's bedroom, had been converted into a home office with new furniture. Garrett had moved his girlfriend into his daughter's bedroom. When Callum saw that photo, he set his phone down on his desk and sat very still for a very long time. His hands were flat on the surface, his jaw was locked, and the men who worked for him knew this expression. It was the expression that preceded decisions, not impulsive decisions, not angry ones, but the cold, calculated, irreversible kind that changed the shape of someone's life. Meanwhile, in the apartment on Ashford Street, something was changing. Elise had started school. Whitmore Elementary had been surprisingly accommodating once the enrollment process was initiated. Grace had helped with the paperwork, using the Ashford address and Vivienne's identification, and within 4 days, Elise was sitting in Mrs. Patterson's second-grade classroom with a new backpack and a fresh set of supplies. She was quiet at school. The teacher noted it. She completed her work, participated when called on, and spent recess sitting on a bench near the building, watching the other children play. And she wasn't antisocial. She was assessing, measuring the environment, deciding what was safe. On her 3rd day, a girl named Sophie sat down next to her on the bench and asked what she was looking at. Elise said, "Everything." Sophie considered this for a moment and then said, "Do you want to see the garden? There's worms." Elise went with her. It was a small thing, a 7-year-old being led to a school garden by another 7-year-old to look at earthworms in the dirt. But Vivienne, who heard about it that evening, had to leave the room for a moment. The nightmares were harder to manage. Elise had them 3 or 4 times a week. Not screaming nightmares, not the kind that wake the whole house, but the quiet kind. She would whimper in her sleep, and her hands would clench into fists. And she would wake up with her pillow damp and her eyes wide and confused, as if she wasn't sure where she was. Vivienne would lie next to her and stroke her hair until she fell back to sleep, and in those dark hours, with her daughter's small body curled against hers, Vivienne felt the full weight of what Garrett had done, not just to her, but to a child who had done nothing wrong except be born to a man who saw her as a prop in his performance of a good life. Callum, for his part, was fighting his own quiet battle. He had not expected this, any of it. He had spent 6 years building a careful fortress around the place where Rosie's memory lived, not suppressing it, not denying it, but containing it. He had learned to function around the loss, the way you learn to function with a chronic injury. You accommodate it. You adjust your movements. You stop expecting it to heal, and instead accept it as a permanent feature of your landscape. But Elise was dismantling that fortress without trying. Every time she looked at him with those serious, trusting eyes, every time she saved a piece of bread in her pocket, every time she said something that landed in the exact place where his daughter used to live inside him. She wasn't Rosie. He never confused them, never projected, never tried to replace one child with another. They were different people. Rosie had been loud and fearless and prone to laughter that could fill an entire room. Elise was careful and watchful and measured her words like currency. But they shared something that Callum couldn't name, a quality of presence, a gravity, a way of looking at the world that demanded you take them seriously, even though they were small enough to carry. One night, after a visit to the apartment where Elise had shown him a drawing of a whale and asked him 14 questions about submarines, Callum drove home to his house on the east side of the city. It was a large house, too large for one person, a fact he'd known for years but had never done anything about. He sat in his car in the driveway for 10 minutes with the engine running, looking at the dark windows, and felt the loneliness of the place with a sharpness that surprised him. He'd been lonely for 6 years. He'd been fine with it. Or he'd told himself he was fine with it, which is a different thing entirely. He went inside, poured a glass of bourbon, and sat in the living room with the lights off. On the shelf behind him, in a frame he hadn't moved since it was placed there, was a photograph of Angela and Rosie at the beach. Rosie was holding a shell up to the camera, her face split with a grin. Angela was laughing behind her. The ocean was behind them both. Callum didn't look at the photograph. He didn't need to. He'd memorized it years ago. Every pixel, every shadow. He finished his bourbon and went to bed. But at the apartment, in the evenings, when it was just her and Vivian and sometimes Callum, who had developed a habit of stopping by around 6 with takeout containers from one of his restaurants, Elise was different. She talked. She asked questions. She drew pictures at the kitchen table with markers that Callum had brought. And she showed them to him with a shy pride that made his chest hurt. In a way, he had stopped fighting. One evening, she drew a picture of 3 people standing in front of a building. 2 tall figures and 1 small one. The building had a sign that said books. Above the 3 figures, she had drawn a sun that was far too large, with rays extending to the edges of the paper. "Who's that?" Callum asked, pointing to the tallest figure. "That's you," Elise said. He looked at the picture. The tallest figure had dark scribbles for hair and a square jaw and was holding a bag that Elise had labeled food. The medium figure was holding the small figure's hand. The sun was yellow and enormous and impossibly bright. "That's a big sun," Callum said. "Because it's warm now," Elise said. Then she went back to drawing, and Callum stood there in the kitchen of an apartment he owned, above a bookstore, and felt something move inside his chest that he had thought was dead. But the confrontation came on a Thursday, 5 weeks after the night in the alley. It didn't come the way people might expect. No dark parking lot, no threats, no violence. Callum had never been a man who used force when leverage would do. Force was loud and messy and created problems that outlived the satisfaction. Leverage was quiet and permanent. Garrett Harlow was served with legal papers on a Thursday morning at his office, in front of his colleagues, by a process server who had been specifically chosen for her professional, neutral demeanor. The papers were from a family court attorney named Nina Vasquez, one of the best in the city, a woman who had never lost a custody case and whose hourly rate was comfortably in the 4 figures. She was also someone who took pro bono cases when the circumstances warranted it, and when Callum had sat across from her and explained the situation. The false accusations, the fabricated evidence, the eviction of a woman and child from their home, Nina had set down her coffee and said, "I'll take it." She wasn't pro bono exactly. Callum was covering her fees. Vivian didn't know this, and he intended to keep it that way. The legal filing was comprehensive. It included the evidence of the fabricated text messages, the prepaid SIM card receipt, the IP address trace, the timeline showing that the fake social media profile had been created from Garrett's home network. It included a forensic analysis of Vivian's actual phone records, which showed no communication with the supposed lover. It included financial records demonstrating that Garrett had concealed Vivian's contribution to the down payment. It included sworn statements from the motel manager and the shelter intake worker who had interacted with Vivian and Elise, documenting the conditions in which they'd been living. And it included a screenshot of Tessa Whitford's Instagram, with Elise's former bedroom visible in the background, converted into a home office. The filing requested an emergency hearing. full custody reversal, restoration of Vivian's property rights, an investigation into Garrett's fraudulent conduct. Garrett called Vivian 30 minutes after being served. She was at the Ashford apartment. Elise was at school. Callum was not there. He was across town at a construction site, checking on a renovation project, when his phone rang with Vivian's name on the screen. "He just called me," Vivian said. Her voice was shaking, but not from fear. Something else, something closer to the tremor that precedes an earthquake. "He was screaming. He said I had no right to do this. He said he would destroy me. He said he would tell the judge I was living off the charity of a criminal, and that I was unfit to be a mother." Callum stopped walking. The construction crew behind him continued drilling. He pressed the phone closer to his ear. "What did you say?" he asked. "I told him to say whatever he needed to say to his lawyer because I was done talking to him, and then I hung up." A beat of silence. "Good," Callum said. "But Callum," my hands were shaking. "They're still shaking. I could hear it in his voice. And he's not scared. He's furious. And Garrett, when he's furious, he doesn't scream and get it out of his system. He goes quiet. He plans." "So do I," Callum said. "Don't answer his calls again. Let everything go through Nina." 3 days later, Garrett showed up at the apartment. It was a Wednesday afternoon. Elise was still at school. Vivian was at the kitchen table, going through financial documents that Nina had requested. Bank statements, tax returns, anything that showed her contributions to the marriage's finances. The doorbell rang. She looked through the peephole and felt her blood turn to ice water. Garrett stood on the landing. He was wearing his work clothes. Pressed slacks, a blue button down, his good watch. He looked exactly the way he always looked, composed, handsome, reasonable. And the kind of man whose neighbors described him as wonderful. The kind of man that no one would believe was dangerous because he never raised his hand. His weapons were words, isolation, and patience. Vivian didn't open the door. "Viv," Garrett said through the door. His voice was calm, measured, the voice he used when he wanted something. "I just want to talk, 5 minutes, that's all." She stood behind the door with her phone in her hand and said nothing. "I know you're in there. I saw your car." A pause. "This has gotten out of hand. We both know that. I don't want it to get worse. I'm not angry. I just think we should talk, like adults, before lawyers make everything harder than it needs to be." Vivian's thumb hovered over Callum's number. She didn't press it. Instead, she pressed Nina Vasquez's. "He's at my door," she said when Nina answered. "Don't open it. Don't speak to him. I'm noting the date and time. If he doesn't leave in 5 minutes, call the police." Garrett knocked again. "Viv, come on. This isn't like you. You're not the kind of person who hides behind a door." That was the line that nearly broke her, because it was the same voice, the same tone, the same careful selection of words that he'd used for 8 years to make her feel like her reactions were wrong, like she was being unreasonable, like the rational adult thing to do was whatever he wanted, and anything else was childish or paranoid or dramatic. It was the voice that had kept her in a marriage where she was slowly disappearing, because every time she pushed back, he made her feel like the problem. And she pressed her back against the door and closed her eyes and said nothing. After 4 minutes, Garrett left. He didn't slam anything. He didn't shout. He simply walked down the stairs and got into his car and drove away. It was, in its own way, more frightening than if he'd raged, because a man who can stand at a locked door and speak calmly while his entire scheme is collapsing is a man who still believes he can control the situation. Callum learned about the visit an hour later. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't make threats. He called Sullivan, the retired detective, and said, "I need a closer eye on Garrett Harlow. Specifically, I need to know if he goes near Ashford Street again." Then he called Grace Pellegrino and had a camera installed in the hallway outside the apartment door by the end of the day. And then he called Vivian and asked if she was okay. She said yes. He could hear that she wasn't. But he didn't push, because he understood that Vivian's recovery, her ability to trust herself, to stand on her own, to believe that she was capable of handling things, was as important as her physical safety. If he swooped in every time something difficult happened, he would become another Garrett, a different kind of controller, but a controller nonetheless. And that was the last thing she needed. Elise is doing better at school, Vivian said, changing the subject deliberately. Mrs. Patterson says she raised her hand in class today. 3 times. 3 times. Apparently she corrected the teacher's pronunciation of an ocean animal, some kind of crustacean. Mrs. Patterson said she was very polite about it, but very firm. Callum smiled. It was the kind of smile that happened involuntarily, without permission, the kind that cracked his carefully maintained composure. That sounds right, he said. The hearing was scheduled for 2 weeks later. In the interim, Garrett Harlow unraveled. He didn't unravel the way people do in movies, dramatically all at once, in a single cathartic scene. He unraveled the way real people do, slowly, messily, in a cascade of small miscalculations that compounded each other. First, he contacted Vivian's family, her mother, her sister. He told them that Vivian had fallen in with a dangerous man, that she was under his influence, that Elise was in danger. He expected the same reaction he'd gotten when he'd first presented his accusations. Sympathy, belief, an alliance. But something had shifted. Nina Vasquez had preemptively sent a letter to Vivian's mother outlining the evidence in the case. Not details, just enough. The fabricated messages, the prepaid phone, the IP trace. She'd included her bar number and her office address, and an invitation to call with any questions. Vivian's mother called Nina. They spoke for 45 minutes. When the call ended, Vivian's mother sat at her kitchen table for a long time. Then she called her younger daughter, Vivian's sister, and they talked for another hour. Then Vivian's mother called Vivian and said, "I am so sorry." Those 4 words, insufficient, too late, but genuine, cracked something open in Vivian that all the warm apartments and bowls of soup in the world couldn't reach. She cried for the first time in 6 weeks, not in front of Elise. In the bathroom, with the water running, with her hand pressed over her mouth, she cried the way people cry when a wall comes down and everything behind it rushes forward at once. Grief and rage and relief and exhaustion, all of it tangled together, all of it overdue. Garrett's second mistake was Tessa. He had apparently told her that the legal situation was under control, that his lawyer would handle it, that Vivian's case had no merit. But Tessa had searched Nina Vasquez's name online and discovered her reputation, the undefeated record, the high-profile cases, the Bar Association awards, and she had panicked. 3 days before the hearing, Tessa moved out of the Birchwood Lane house. She did it while Garrett was at work. She took her things and left a note that said simply, "I can't be part of this." Garrett came home to a half-empty house and the first real taste of what Vivian had felt when she came home to garbage bags on the porch. His third mistake was the hearing itself. Garrett's attorney was competent, but outmatched. Nina Vasquez was a force in the courtroom, precise, methodical, devastatingly calm. She presented the evidence in chronological order, building the narrative the way you build a house. Foundation first, then walls, then roof. By the time she introduced the IP address evidence, proving that the fake social media profile had been created from Garrett's own home, the judge was looking at Garrett with an expression that attorneys recognize and defendants fear, the expression of a person who has already made up their mind. Garrett tried to speak. His attorney advised against it. Garrett spoke anyway. She's living with a criminal," he said, his voice rising. "Callum Rourke. Everyone knows who he is. She's exposing my daughter to a dangerous—" "Mr. Harlow," the judge said, "we are here to examine the evidence regarding the dissolution of your marriage and the custody of your child. If you have concerns about your daughter's living situation, you may file a separate motion. Right now, I am looking at documented evidence that you fabricated accusations of infidelity, fraudulently manipulated financial records, and unlawfully evicted your wife and minor child from the family home. Do you have evidence to counter these specific claims?" Garrett's mouth opened. Nothing came out. The judge granted Vivian temporary full custody. She ordered Garrett to vacate the Birchwood Lane house within 30 days, pending a full property assessment. She referred the case to the district attorney's office for review of potential fraud charges. And she noted, in her written ruling, that Garrett's conduct constituted a pattern of coercive control that had placed a minor child in immediate danger. Vivienne sat in the courtroom and listened to the ruling. She did not smile. She did not celebrate. She sat with her hands folded in her lap and her eyes forward, and when it was over, she stood, thanked Nina Vasquez, and walked out of the courthouse into the cold December air. Callum was waiting on the sidewalk. He hadn't been inside the courtroom. He'd made that decision deliberately. This was Vivienne's fight, Vivienne's moment, and his presence in the courtroom would have given Garrett's attorney ammunition. A man with Callum's reputation, sitting behind the petitioner, would have complicated things. So he waited on the sidewalk, hands in his coat pockets, watching the door. Vivienne came out. She saw him. She walked toward him. She stopped 3 feet away. "Thank you," she said. "You did this," Callum said. "You and Nina. You know what I mean." He did, but acknowledging it directly felt like it would break something fragile. The careful, unspoken arrangement they'd maintained for weeks, where every act of help was framed as practical, as logical, as anything other than what it was. "Elise gets out of school at 3, Callum said. "I thought I'd pick up pizza." Vivienne looked at him for a long moment. Her eyes were red. Her face was drawn with exhaustion. But somewhere in her expression, beneath the fatigue and the caution and the 6 weeks of fear, there was something new, not happiness exactly. Something quieter, something steadier. "She likes pepperoni," Vivienne said. "I know." They walked to the car. They didn't speak about the courtroom, or the ruling, or the future. They talked about pizza toppings, and whether Elise would want garlic knots, and whether the bookstore downstairs was having a sale this weekend. Ordinary things. The kind of conversation that people have when they are, slowly and imperfectly, building the scaffolding of a life. The weeks after the hearing were not a fairy tale. Vivienne moved back into the Birchwood Lane house in January, after Garrett vacated as ordered. She walked through the rooms of her own home like a stranger, touching the walls, opening the closets, standing in the kitchen where she had cooked 1,000 meals for a man who had plotted her destruction while eating her food and sleeping in her bed. Elise's room was the hardest. The pink walls had been painted over with gray. The small bookshelf where Elise kept her picture books and stuffed animals had been replaced with a desk and a monitor. The bed was gone. The star-shaped nightlight that Vivienne had bought when Elise was 3, the one she couldn't sleep without, was in a box in the garage. Vivienne found the nightlight. She plugged it in. She put it on the floor in the center of the gray room and stood there looking at it. This small, cheap, star-shaped plastic thing that meant everything and nothing. And then she began the slow work of putting her daughter's world back together. Callum helped. Not with grand gestures, with logistics. He sent 2 men from one of his crews to repaint the room. He had Grace source a new bed, a bookshelf, a rug with butterflies on it that Elise had pointed out in a catalog. He arranged for a security system to be installed at the house. Cameras, motion sensors, monitored alarm, because Vivienne was still afraid, and he understood that the law could protect her from Garrett's lies, but not from Garrett's rage, and those were 2 different things. He also, without telling Vivienne, arranged for a friend of his, a retired detective named Sullivan, who now did private consulting, to maintain a quiet awareness of Garrett's movements. Not surveillance, not intimidation, just attention, the kind of attention that ensured that if Garrett decided to do something reckless, there would be someone positioned to know about it before it became dangerous. This was how Callum Rourke protected people, not with guns or threats, though those tools existed in his world, and he would not pretend otherwise. He protected people by making the architecture of their safety so thorough and so invisible that they could, eventually, stop being afraid. Vivienne's mother came to visit on a Sunday in late January. Her name was Frances, and she drove 2 hours from upstate to stand on the porch of the Birchwood Lane house with a casserole dish in her hands and an expression on her face that Vivienne had never seen before. Shame. Not the performed kind, the real kind. The kind that ages a person overnight and sits in the lines around their eyes. Vivienne opened the door. She did not hug her mother. And she stood in the doorway and looked at this woman who had believed a lie over her own daughter and felt something so complex it had no name. Anger and grief and love and exhaustion all knotted together into a weight that pressed on her chest. "Can I come in?" Frances asked. Vivienne stepped aside. They sat in the living room. Frances set the casserole on the coffee table. Elise was upstairs reading. The house was quiet. "I should have asked you," Frances said. She wasn't crying. Her voice was steady and raw. "Before anything else, before I believed anything or said anything or stopped returning your calls, I should have asked you. I should have said, 'Vivienne, tell me what happened.' And I didn't. And you were out there, you and Elise, and I didn't even know where you were." "We were in an alley," Vivienne said. And she didn't say it to wound. She said it because it was true. And the truth was all she had left to offer. 11 days. We slept in a car for the first 3 nights. Then a shelter. Then we couldn't get into the shelter, so we walked. And I fed my daughter from garbage because I had no money, no phone. Garrett canceled my phone plan on day 2, and no one I could call. Frances pressed her hand over her mouth. Her eyes were wet. "I am so sorry," she said again. "I know," Vivienne said. "But sorry doesn't undo it. Sorry doesn't undo the nights when Elise asked me why Grandma wasn't calling, and I didn't have an answer." They talked for 2 hours. It was not a reconciliation in the fairy tale sense. No tearful embrace. No sudden restoration of trust. It was the beginning of a conversation that would continue for months, maybe years, and with setbacks and silences and difficult truths that neither of them would enjoy facing. But it was a beginning. And beginnings, Vivienne was learning, were worth more than she'd thought. When Frances left, she stopped on the porch and said, "The man who helped you, Callum, Garrett says he's dangerous." "Garrett says a lot of things," Vivienne said. "Most of them aren't true. But is he dangerous?" Vivienne thought about this for a moment. She thought about the alley, and the soup, and the apartment, and the legal filing, and the camera in the hallway, and the room repainted pink, and the man who showed up on Saturday mornings with pastries and never once asked for anything in return. "To the people who deserve it," she said. "Yes." Frances looked at her daughter for a long time, and then she nodded, and then she drove home. And the relationship between Callum and Elise deepened in ways that surprised everyone, including Callum. It started with the bookstore. Foxglove and Company, the shop below the Ashford apartment, was run by an elderly woman named Margot, who wore reading glasses on a chain and spoke to children like they were adults. Elise had discovered the store during her second week in the apartment and had developed a routine of visiting after school, sitting in the children's section and reading, or pretending to read, picture books. When Callum learned this, he started stopping by the bookstore on Thursdays, not every Thursday, just often enough that Elise began to expect him. She would look up from her book and see him standing near the doorway, and her face would do something that Callum had no defenses against. It would open, simply, completely, without reservation. The wariness that still lingered in her interactions with most adults disappeared when she saw Callum, because he had never once broken a promise to her, never once raised his voice in her presence, never once disappeared without telling her he was going. She started asking him questions. "Do you have a house?" "Yes." "Is it big?" "It's big enough." "Do you live alone?" A pause. "Yes." "Is it lonely?" Callum looked at her. She was sitting cross-legged on the floor of the bookstore with a book about oceans open in her lap. Her question was not loaded. She wasn't trying to manipulate or extract. She was simply curious, 7-year-old curious, which is the most honest curiosity in the world. "Sometimes," he said. "You should get a cat," Elise said. "Cats don't get lonely because they like being alone. But they also like when you come home." "That's very wise. Mrs. Patterson says wisdom is when you know something, and you also know why you know it." Mrs. Patterson sounds like a smart woman. She is. She also has a cat. Callum bought Elise a book that day, a big, illustrated encyclopedia of marine animals. She carried it home like a treasure, and that night she showed Vivienne every page and explained with solemn authority, The difference between a porpoise and a dolphin. 3 months after the night in the alley, Vivian was standing in her kitchen, in her own house, making coffee on a Saturday morning. Elise was at the table eating cereal and reading the marine book, her feet swinging off the chair. The star-shaped nightlight was still plugged in upstairs, even though Elise had admitted, with some embarrassment, that she didn't really need it anymore. Callum arrived at 10. He had a bag of pastries from a bakery he liked, and a newspaper he'd already read. It was a routine they'd fallen into without discussion. Saturday mornings, coffee, pastries. Elise telling Callum facts about ocean life while he nodded with exaggerated seriousness. They were ordinary mornings, and they were extraordinary, because 6 months ago, Vivian had been searching through garbage in a freezing alley, and Elise had been hiding bread in her pocket, and the idea that they would one day sit in a warm kitchen on a Saturday morning and feel safe was so distant, it might as well have been fiction. Vivian poured Callum a cup of coffee. She set it in front of him. Their hands didn't touch, but they were close enough too. Then something hung in the air between them. Had been hanging for weeks, something neither of them had named. Garrett signed the papers, Vivian said. The divorce is final next month. Callum nodded. He picked up his coffee. The DA's office is pursuing fraud charges. Nina says he'll probably take a plea deal. Good. Vivian sat down across from him. She wrapped both hands around her mug. I've been thinking about the apartment on Ashford. What about it? I'm not there anymore. It's empty again. I know. You should rent it, to someone who needs it. Callum looked at her over his coffee. There was something in her expression, a resolve, but also a gentleness, that told him she was saying more than she was saying. She was telling him that she was no longer someone who needed rescuing. She was standing on her own. And that the space between them, which had been defined by crisis and gratitude and unspoken debt, needed to be redefined or released. I had an idea about that, he said. Grace mentioned there's a woman, single mother, 2 kids, just lost her housing. Similar situation to yours. Vivian smiled. It was small. It was real. Then you should give it to her. I was thinking you could help. Talk to her. Show her the neighborhood, the school, the bookstore. Vivian's smile deepened by a fraction. You want me to be your intake coordinator? I want you to be the person you needed 6 months ago. The words landed. Vivian's eyes glistened, but she didn't look away. She held his gaze, and in that look was everything that had passed between them. The alley, the soup, the tiramisu, the legal papers. In the pink room painted gray, and then pink again, the drawing with the too big sun, all of it. Okay, she said. Elise looked up from her book. Did you know, she said, addressing Callum with the earnest gravity of a tenured professor, that an octopus has 3 hearts? I did not know that. 1 heart pumps blood to the body, and 2 hearts pump blood to the gills, so an octopus can love 3 times as much as a person. That's not exactly how hearts work, Vivian said gently. It could be, Elise said. You don't know. Callum looked at this little girl, this small, serious, unbowed person who had eaten bread from a garbage can and saved half in her pocket and apologized for being hungry, and felt all 3 of an octopus's hearts beating in his chest. And there's a world that most people see, a world of clear lines and simple categories. Good people and bad people, criminals and citizens, villains and heroes. In that world, Callum Rourke was a man to be feared, a man whose name was spoken carefully, whose business was understood but not discussed, whose power existed in the space between the legal and the illicit, casting shadows that most people crossed the street to avoid. But there is another world underneath that one, a quieter world, where a man who has done terrible things sits on the floor of a bookstore reading about dolphins with a 7-year-old girl who trusts him completely. Where a woman who lost everything finds her voice in a courtroom and then uses it to help the next woman who is losing everything. Where a building that once housed strangers becomes a sanctuary, and a kitchen that once saw a family broken becomes the place where a new kind of family imperfect, unlikely, held together not by blood but by choice, learns to exist. Sometimes the people society fears the most are the ones who protect the innocent when everyone else looks away. Not because they are saints, not because they have been redeemed, but because they have seen enough of the world's cruelty to recognize it instantly, and they have enough power to stand between that cruelty and the people it targets, and, crucially, essentially, against all logic and self-interest, they choose to do so. Callum Rourke chose. And in a small house on Birchwood Lane, on a Saturday morning in March, any 7-year-old girl who once flinched at the sound of a trash bag hitting a dumpster sat at a kitchen table with a bowl of cereal and a book about oceans and told a man she was not afraid of that an octopus has 3 hearts. And the man, who had 1 heart and had thought it was broken beyond repair, discovered that it still worked. It had been working all along. He had simply forgotten how to feel it beating until a little girl in an alley, shivering in a summer jacket, tucked a piece of bread into her pocket and reminded him.